Great, good afternoon. I'm William Wan. I'm a science correspondent at the Washington Post. Our next discussion is going to focus on the convergence between medicine and emerging technology. So joining me on the stage for the conversation, we have Dr. Anthony Attala. He's the director of the Wake Forest Institute for Regenerative Medicine. And Dr. Attala has been doing this groundbreaking work in area of creating organs, manufacturing bones, tissue, various ways of doing that, including 3D printing, some very exciting work over the last decade. And then also joining us, we have Dr. Daniel Kraft. He's the founding executive director and chair of the Exponential Medicine at Singularity University. And Dr. Kraft's program explores convergent, rapidly developing technologies and their potential in biomedicine and healthcare. And then we have Dr. James Liu. He's Senior Vice President of Applied Genomics and co-founder of the Silicon Valley startup Helix. Helix is sequencing customers' DNA and matching them with genetic tests for hereditary diseases and other personalized tests and health-related products. And last, we have Dr. Girish Pucha. He's Chief Medical Officer at the health tech startup Freenome, which conducts research and accelerates accessible and non-invasive disease screenings to treat cancer and other diseases at earlier stages. This is otherwise, I think some applications are called they call it liquid biopsy, is that right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I just want to say thank you all for joining us. So I guess I'll start with you, Dr. Attala. I'm just curious, can you give us an idea of where things stand now? We've been hearing about creating organs as a way of helping, just this enormous need for transplant organs. Can you give us an idea of lay of the land where things stand? Yeah.
Absolutely, thank you. So, one of the challenges today is that there's just so many people who require an organ. The number of patients who actually are on the wait list has actually gone up six times in about a 25-year period. And in that time period, the actual number of transplants has barely gone up. And the challenge, of course, is that we need more organs, and that is because we're living longer. So as we live longer, organs tend to fail. So this field of regenerative medicine really tries to achieve the creation of these tissues and organs to try to replace some of these challenges in terms of the shortage.
Where are things headed? So a decade from now, what are we going to see possible in your mind?
Well, right now, we do have some tissues have actually entered patient trials. So we do have a number of tissues now. Flat structures, such as skin, for example, which are the least complex. Tubular structures have also entered clinical trials, such as blood vessels. Hollow non-tubular organs, like the bladder, vaginal organs. These organs are already now in patients. So patients are walking around with these engineered organs. The big challenge, of course, are the solid organs, the heart, the lung, the kidney. And for those, I think that's still going to be a while in terms of getting these organs into patients. But there are now cell therapies, which are patient-specific, not stem cells per se, but the patient's own cells that can be grown and expanded and then placed back into the body to augment functionality. And that's actually also in clinical trials now. So I think the future in 10 years, you're going to see a larger number of these tissues going into patients, and you're going to see more patients, hopefully, benefiting from these technologies.
Is there a holy grail in terms of, like a Moby Dick for you? This is the organ that is the most complex. If we've achieved this, we've achieved regenerative medicine.
Well, in fact, the one organ which is in most need is the kidney. So if you look at the whole transplant wait list, 90% of the patients waiting for an organ are actually waiting for a kidney at an immense cost to our healthcare system. So the average cost of having a patient on dialysis, for example, which is a system to make sure that these machines take care of the function the kidney would take care of, the average cost for a patient to be on these treatments is about $250,000 per year per patient. So you can imagine these numbers adding up. So from a social standpoint, making patients' lives better, improving their health, improving their daily quality of life, as well as having a savings to our healthcare system, the kidney would be the ideal one.
Okay. Oh, Great. And then Dr. Liu, I was going to ask you, you're on the kind of the frontiers. Dr. Adela, he's been going at this for decades. This regenerative medicine has been proceeding, albeit kind of slowly. It seems like at the cusp of this new frontier of genomics. And I'm curious, what do you see as the possible applications in the immediate term? And then looking 20, 30 years, like how do you see this playing out?
Yeah. It's a great question, and thank you for having me here, William, and thank you to the Washington Post. I think what I'll do is take a quick step back and explain a little bit of how we thought about the major trends we see in the healthcare system and why we set up Helix the way we did. And I think the first one was we saw there's an increasing hunger for individuals and for patients to understand much more about their personal health. And that we see that in the rapid adoption of digital health technologies. Many people are now texting their physicians, they're engaging in wearable technology, they're using telemedicine, and that, frankly, these engaged patients are going to be a big part of their health over time, and that it's important to understand themselves, but also their genetic data over time. I think the second thing we saw a lot of was that, frankly, the cost of sensors and gathering data about individuals is basically going to zero. Although it seems like iPhones keep going up in price, sensor technology is going down to zero. And the genome will be fairly similar in that way, which is the cost to acquire genomes is going to go down as well. And so the real opportunity is going to end up being at this intersection of all these disparate data sets that are residing in all these applications around people. And frankly, I think as of right now, the vast majority of, I would say, health data around individuals actually does not get generated in the health system anymore. That's going to be generated on your cell phone. And with 2.5 billion cell phones in the world now, everyone's walking around carrying the sensor around them all the time. And the third one, I think, is, as we think about applications, is that there is no such a golden egg application or such a perfect application, unicorn application. And that in order to really deliver new research or outcomes for individuals, you had to leverage the strengths of a broader ecosystem of players. And so when we built Helix, we built it as a personal genome platform with the user at the center who gets sequenced and they can control their data and how they see fit. And they can interpret it with high-quality partners like we have with the Mayo Clinic or Geisinger. And we think for everyone, they're going to have different applications they care about. And so some people will come in and say, my big question for myself is, where am I from and who am I? Some will come in and say, can I have a healthy family? And that'll be an application like carrier screening. And some will come in and say, what can I do from a preventive standpoint? And we have partners there like Mayo Clinic. And so we hope that these applications will help people make better decisions for their personal health, but also provide a broader opportunity to potentially contribute their data to broader humanity as well.
So say like 30 years from now, when everybody's genome is sequenced, it's a regular, like going to the bank or whatnot. Like how do you see this interacting in their daily life? So like, would it be part of your, like what daily experiences would it be part of?
I think it's a great question. I think the first part is to realize that if the cost is going towards zero, I think everyone will expect to be sequenced. So everyone in this room today is very likely, if they choose to have the opportunity to be sequenced. The second piece is that I think today it's a activation energy to talk about sequencing. Oh, I'm going to get my DNA sequenced. But in 30 years, it will be ubiquitous. So it won't be a question, have you been sequenced? It will be, why haven't you been? And the question won't be, can you show me your data? It will be, the data already exists there. And so your first interaction with data will not be a DNA question. It will be that the data exists in your health record. And you'll just show up, and they will know those things about you. And your physician will ask you targeted questions based on the things they see in your genetics, not that you will go in and bring your genetic data to them.
So in that 30-year scenario, like what application would there be for that? Is this strictly in like diet, disease? Are there things outside of that as well, or what?
I think we should think about it not in terms of genetic questions, but in terms of questions that consumers may have or health questions that the medical system may have.
Okay.
So in the questions of pharmacogenetics, which Dr. Collins just talked about, the question will be, how do I deliver you more personalized treatment regimens, and how do I become more healthy faster? And genetics will play a role in that. I don't think you'll think about it as a DNA test. It will just be embedded in the system. You may decide that you want to have a family, and so carrier screening will be de facto. It will be normal to have a carrier screen. You'll probably know what diseases you might carry from an autosomal recessive perspective much earlier in life. And if you have a family history of heart attacks and cardiac disease, you'll have that history plus your genetic risk scores as well, and they'll be combined to provide you more complete view into your own health.
Do you get a lot of questions about like the nightmare scenarios of DNA being, like discrimination, biosecurity, that kind of stuff?
Yeah. I actually think what will happen as we normalize access to DNA information is that we'll start to treat it in the appropriate manner. I think today there is this perception that it is your destiny. I think we are very quickly going to have to dispel that myth. And that will be healthier for everyone as well.
Okay, that's helpful. And Dr. Pucha, I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the state of play for liquid biopsy, for the work that Freenome does?
Yeah, very much. Thanks. Thank you again, William, for the invitation, and thanks to the Post. Sure. So I always shudder a little bit when the phrase liquid biopsy is uttered, because it's sort of come to mean everything and nothing. And by that, what I mean is that it actually conflates quite a few different applications of effectively looking at things in the circulation or otherwise available non-invasively, whether they be saliva, urine, or something like that, and trying to glean from that sort of health status that previously would have basically required an invasive biopsy, right? That fundamentally is sort of what the promise of liquid biopsies is supposed to be. But what I mean when I say it conflates a bunch of intended uses for that sort of approach is that if we just take the example of cancer to focus it, since that's really where it's that technology and that approach currently certainly has the most significant play, is it can be everything from detecting cancer early on to actually determining how to treat that cancer based on the mutational profile that you see in circulating tumor DNA, to actually effectively monitoring the efficacy of that treatment and looking for minimal residual disease and things like that, right? And the reality is that whether it be from purely a sort of validity standpoint, do you actually see what you think you see, and does it mean what you think it means? The levels of the levels of evidence that would be required to prove that is one thing, and then similarly, even more so from a clinical utility standpoint, coming back to comments that were made earlier, if you could detect this, can you actually intervene in such a way that actually has a health outcome benefit? Those two threads have not been tied together very well. So in many ways, the challenges currently, in my view, in the field are less about the technology and what we can do than whether if we do it, we actually do benefit the patient and do so in a cost-effective manner.
In your work especially, I imagine when you're at the very outset of something like this, you encounter a lot of doubters, right? Whether it's investment or regulation, or have you developed any way of responding to that, or any lessons learned from?
Well, I think, so my background's a little checkered, shall we say. I've been on the investor side of this. Obviously, I've trained as a physician in molecular genetics. I've actually also been in startups such as the one that I'm in right now, but I've also worked on sort of the payer side and the regulator side of this as well. And the good, the bad, and the ugly of having those different perspectives is I'm sort of inherently a skeptic myself. And so I think, to be frank, the best proof at the end of the day is good science and good medicine, and sort of having transparency around that. So the threads that I was talking about, sort of very simply, the analytical validity of what you're doing, the clinical validity of what you're doing, which is really just saying, do you measure what you say you measure accurately and reproducibly? Does that thing that you're measuring actually matter? Is it associated with some clinical endpoint like the detection of cancer or drug response that matters? And then if you then use that, does that actually prove useful and benefit outcomes? So I think at the end of the day, what we would do to sort of, I think the field as a whole has to sort of put up or shut up, and the best way to do that is to do good studies that are appropriately sized and powered. It's not the sexiest thing to hear, but at the end of the day, this is how medicine moves forward. And to answer those questions that, frankly, if you're a patient, that you would want answered. Is this, if I'm going to do this, is it actually going to change how you take care of me, and is that change actually going to help me? Yeah. Suffice it to say, we don't need another Theranos on our hands.
Right. And Dr. Kraft, I'm curious, you have such a unique perspective from seeing all these fields and how they develop and how it intersects with technology. Can you talk a little bit about what has what has you most excited out of all the convergences between tech and health in the horizon? Like, what are you most excited about?
I think the real opportunity here is to sort of shift our mindset about healthcare, which is really much more sick care. You know, I'm trained in internal medicine, pediatrics, oncology. We have a system now where the data we get, whether it's our blood pressures or our genomics, comes to us in scattered, intermittent pieces. And so the data flows are broken, and we're therefore very reactive. We wait for the heart attack, the stroke, or cancer to present at late stage, or someone to need a kidney transplant. I'm most excited about this sort of super convergence, the ability now to move to much more continuous data flowing through our smartphones and our connected rings and tied to our personal genetic databases, and then to be much more individually proactive as an individual. If you had your own sort of check engine light for your body based on your digital exhaust, your sort of Internet of medical things, and including to flow to your clinician, your healthcare teams, to pick up disease early rather than late, or if you have a disease like diabetes, or anything else, to manage it in a much more smarter, tuned way. And we really live in this amazing exponential age. You know, 17 years ago when Dr. Collins was first sequencing the human genome, it was billions of dollars or millions of dollars. The price of sequencing has dropped at twice the rate of Moore's law, to $1,000 or maybe $100 soon. The price of wearables and data are getting cheap. 3D printing is becoming something you can have in your home. So I'm most excited the fact that now clinicians, researchers, others from different fields can come together to look at how we can mash these up to address a lot of the challenges we have across healthcare.
Do you, I wanted to ask you a little bit also, all of you up here are, wear two hats. You know, there's the medical side, the research side, but also the entrepreneurial side. I'm curious, can you talk a little bit about the convergence between technology and health, Silicon Valley and medicine, and how has that evolved over the last decade? Yeah.
Well, you know, one example, I mean, we're here in 2017. It's only 10 years ago, essentially this fall, that the first iPhone launched, right? These have become obviously medicalized platforms. My old iPhone 2, this antique, would seem slow and clunky if you had to use it. It was magical at the time. The iPhone 10 that's coming out will soon seem antique. So what's been interesting, in at least where I come from out of the Bay Area, at Silicon, at Singularity University and exponential medicine, is that you've got a lot of folks coming from other technological fields, folks who do machine learning and have built games who want to apply them on our mobile platforms, or building, my antique Google Glass as well, VR programs, augmented reality, things that could be used for gaming are now being played out in the operating room. The challenge is often these folks are very enthusiastic, but a bit naive, but to the realities of getting these things paid for, regulated, how a surgeon's going to interact with it versus a patient versus a caregiver, and sometimes those need to mash. But there's a lot of new energy, a lot of the new beginner's mind coming that's helping catalyze new thinking.
Can you talk about what are some of the pitfalls when you have this kind of this merging between these two kind of cultures or these two worlds? From what you've seen in recent years, like what's the potential and what's the pitfalls of some of that?
Well, some of the potential, we talked about all these omics information. The movie Gattaca, 20-year-old movie, raises some of the issues about what happens when you have your omics and others and people not understanding it or applying it in strange other ways. I started my medical residency at Mass General 20 years ago. I can't keep up to date with all the omics, let alone what was just published. So some of the pitfalls are not allowing it to come to the clinician at that last mile. If Dr. Tal is here looking at my genome, how's he going to pick the right drug or right 3D printed kidney for me? How do you integrate that? How do you take all the medical information and sift it and provide it proactively to the consumer, the patient, the caregiver, pharma, medical industry? So that's one of the pitfalls.
Yeah, I would actually just add one point to that. I think the issue is actually that you have to provide information in a way that's appropriate to the context of the patient, right? You want to make sure they understand it however they see fit, and that you can meet them where they are and not necessarily have to bring them all the way to you. And so we think a lot about how do you enable an ecosystem of partners and the right players from all different places, whether or not that's a large institution like a Mayo Clinic or a small app developer, and how do you build localized experiences that help deliver that information at the right point of time? So it's not just like personalized medicine, but it's also like how do you think about the personalized experience around that, and that makes it, I think, much more relevant and provides the right context.
I think maybe one other point that I just add, I mean, especially when you work in the sort of company that I work in, or that many of the folks here are associated with, there are definitely sort of cultural challenges that sometimes happen there, but it really is that cross-pollination, of course, that is exactly what we're all talking about that I think is so exciting. But I think one of the things, especially from the investor side, that you have to calibrate them on, especially when you have tech investors going into biotechnology, the cycle time is very different from start to finish. It's not 18 months or 2 years. It's more like 7 to 10 if you're lucky, and maybe 4 to 6 if you're really lucky. and really good and just happen to do everything right. So I think just setting expectations in a certain sense. I mean, some of the challenges in medicine are the challenges in medicine because, you start off thinking, oh, well, if we take artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all these things and apply it to this massive wealth of data that we can learn from our healthcare system, and somehow these things will magically fall out. There's a reason these things are hard, and so we've got better tools, but it will still take us some time to get there, and I think that's part of what we all learn in the application of these really revolutionary technologies and approaches to age-old questions and problems in medicine.
But I'll get to the point that it still takes 10 years, $1 billion plus per drug. We do have the opportunity to reinvent how clinical trials are done. You can download an app with a clinical trial. You can share, be a data donor. And I like to use the analogy, 10 years ago, we're still using paper maps. Today, we all drive with Google Maps or Waze.
Yep.
It's crowdsourced, including the traffic. And part of the future, the near future, is we'll have a bit of a personal GPS that helps guide us. It matches our personality type, our omics, helps us, and we share that data to improve the map for all of us. And we need the pharma companies, the EMR companies, the academic groups to start sharing so we can do these things in faster, smarter ways.
Great.
This question is for any of you, all of you, but we're in Washington. We're in a room where, where some of these very people are kind of involved in regulation. I'm curious what you think about the role of regulation in terms of how it can accelerate or also hinder innovation, and how you've seen some of those play out in your own work. Yeah.
I'm happy to go first if you want. No, I mean, honestly, I think my approach to that is actually maybe somewhat counterintuitive, because the usual canned answer is, of course, how it hinders innovation and stifles it. I actually think that, and I don't believe this is an oxymoron, but innovation appropriately done can actually facilitate innovation. And the reason I say that is that if it can actually articulate sort of clear and consistent goal lines, level the playing field, and actually effectively facilitate the innovation by protecting the innovator, then I think that then I think it actually both facilitates value creation and the innovation behind it. And just, to give you one very specific example, if I may, of where I believe that is, if you take a look and you just compare as an example sort of the situation that we have in diagnostics with this very old discussion about LDTs and how they're overseen, and you compare that to the situation we have with drugs. The situation we have with diagnostics and the reimbursement and the value creation there is very different, I think, and no one would argue, than it is for drugs. And part of the reason for that is that what we basically do is allow generic diagnostics, or the equivalent of a generic drug, to come out on the market basically at the same time or even before a branded drug, and then claim whatever it wants. You can clearly see how that kind of unlevel playing field really makes for a situation where the innovator who goes through the process, develops rigorous evidence, doesn't get rewarded. There's no incentive to do that. And on top of that, because of intellectual property and everything, they're not well protected even if they do that. So I think that regulation properly done can actually facilitate innovation and create wealth.
Yeah, I'll field that real quickly as well. I think I actually have a great deal of admiration for the regulators, because they have to see brand new technologies and make an assessment about how do you regulate something to be safe and effective in a very small amount of time. They come in and you come in and you're an expert at your field, and they have to basically try to figure out how to become a 30-minute expert in your field. I think no one disagrees that as we introduce new technologies that they should be safe, they should do what they're supposed to do, and they should be effective. And I don't think anyone disagrees about those things. And I think properly done, regulation can be a great accelerant for innovation, that it helps level the playing field and helps prevent people from dirtying the water so that great technologies can emerge.
And with this convergence now, we have digiceuticals. We can prescribe apps for behavior change, et cetera. And we did some work. We had the FDA head of digital health come out to exponential medicine. We've done workshops. And now they've launched a sort of software as a medical device element to speed up regulation of drugs, devices, and elements that cross the digital and therapeutic divide. And now a pre-check system, kind of trying to speed up and get the regulators to get onto the exponential train to some degree.
Yeah, I think two things I'd like to bring up. The first one, of course, is the primary directive is patient safety. Right, that's why the FDA is there, is patient safety, and that's what we want. That's really the most important thing. But the other thing is, as these innovations start to, progress through the cycle of the medical healthcare system, we need to make sure that the regulations are actually up to date, and that they actually address the new technologies. And that is where new regulations that will be specific to the new technologies will be important. It's not so much that the regulations are bad, they're not, they're actually quite good, but how can you improve them based on the new technologies?
I wanted to ask you, Dr. Atala, you've been pushing on this frontier for so long. I'm curious what some of the, what are some of the harder lessons you've learned for other fields that are just on the cusp of beginning, like genomics or other areas? Like, what are some of the lessons you've learned after trying to make this a reality for so long? Yeah.
I think really the early lessons learned, where we really tried to make sure that these technologies were proven, and that they were proven long-term before they actually progressed to a larger number of patients. And that's very important. If you look at new technologies that came about in the last several decades, like gene therapy, for example, and gene therapy was progressing very well, and all of a sudden patient death of a child. It was very tragic. And it really paralyzed the gene therapy field for decades. It really paralyzed the field because people moved too fast to do something they were not too sure about their safety. So I think the main thing with these technologies as they move forward is, yes, we want to move as fast as possible to get these technologies to patients, but to make sure that that you do have all your I's dotted and T's crossed before you really cross that barrier to get into patients and make sure that they really do work out.
I'm also curious, all of you up here are MDs, pushing on frontiers and also working in fields that require entrepreneurship. And I'm curious, what if you were talking to a doctor just at the outset of making that leap into the world of entrepreneurship, like what advice would you have for them? Or
I think all physicians and clinicians and all of us can be entrepreneurs in healthcare. One of the opportunities, if you're a young medical student or resident in the clinic, seeing an unmet need, figuring out new ways to solve it, whether it's using a chatbot or a 3D printer. That we're now in the maker movement. We have a lot of new tools that are disposable to solve problems and then crowdsource the clinical trials and fund it in new ways. What you could do with molecular genetics as a kid in a high school or in your garage, is what a big pharma company could do a decade ago. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to be finding problems and solving them with a sort of shared mindset.
Yeah, I would say, I did my training. I've lived in many places, not just the Valley. I spent many years out here in the Northeast. I did my training in Texas. I spent some time in the Southeast as well. I would say that the Valley does not have a monopoly on innovation, that there are many people everywhere in all sorts of fields that are interested in how can this be better. And I think we just need to help people get them the right tools and properly motivate them so they can make their own local impact.
Right. I mean, it's funny because I don't know about you guys, but I get a lot of sort of, colleagues or whatever wanting me to talk to their kids about what to do next and that sort of thing. And that's sort of it's always a little bit dangerous to pull on strands of your life because you don't always realize all the way that they're interconnected. And so there are things that I would certainly do differently. But my advice to them is very much, I think, what Daniel had said, which is, at the end of the day, what is the goal of a physician? What is the goal of what any of us really do, right? It is really not just to cure disease, right? It is to actually prevent disease and facilitate health. I think I sent you a question about what the actual biomechanical limit of human life is, and the fact that I've never actually gotten a good answer to that question. And if we could, it's just not about preventing disease, right? That is the first step, but it's a step in the way of sort of improving our quality of life. And so to that, medical student, undergrad, high school student, whoever, I think the advice would just be to follow your passion. And if that passion is to actually serve people and try to help them improve the quality of their life, then sort of follow your nose and go where it goes and don't take no for an answer.
Do you guys have any thoughts on juggling the market pressures with the science that you're doing, with the medicine applications that you're trying to make a reality?
I think in a nutshell, it's not just have the technology, the new app, the device, the widget, it's blending that with the incentives. And we don't practice evidence-based medicine, it's reimbursement-based medicine. And we're moving this area of value-based care, paying for things when they work. So with our system here and wherever you're in the world, where we have Obamacare, Trump care, or something else, we need to think about aligning the incentives to stimulate some of these new innovations and bring them to market faster.
Yeah, I think it's about, I agree with this, actually, the statement about how do you align incentives and how do you essentially turn the wheel faster, right? How do you kind of do it in the right way, but how do you accelerate research and the outcomes piece? And how do you take how do you leverage essentially the convergence of these technologies in order to drive those outcomes that we want? And I think it's a lot about how do we think systematically about the incentives, both for institutions, large academic institutions, individual physicians, people themselves, the patients and the participants, as well as the companies that are part of the ecosystem.
Yeah. I think one of the main things, though, is to make sure we de-risk these technologies internally, in academic centers and in areas of lower cost before you take them out into a corporate entity. Because if you do that too early, then the cost of the technology actually goes up exponentially.
Maybe I'll add one quick remark, if I may. There are clearly structural problems in our healthcare system. I mean, and like, what is that saying about, Americans will always do it right after they've exhausted every other option kind of thing? Well, yeah, we sort of do that. So we create bizarre financial incentives in the fact that we sort of have different buckets of money for different aspects of healthcare, hospital services, physician services, drugs, and so forth. So it's hard to have a value-based metric that doesn't cut across everything, that optimizes for both the quality of the outcome and the cost. So until we actually start to fundamentally change some of that, I think we'll continue to optimize within the buckets and not across the buckets.
Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have today, but I'd like to thank Dr. Atala, and Dr. Kraft, and Dr. Liu, and Dr. Pucha for joining our conversation, and I'd like to welcome Washington Post's Chris Karate back to the stage.